I'm Jan Visser, and I'm meeting with Robert Greenberg at his home in Oakland Hills in California. We've known each other for quite some time now,
indeed.
Because we started 4 years ago with this conversation. The background to the conversation is the fact that you wrote a chapter for the book on building understanding on the idea that everything, that context is everything and that everything has meaning. So the key words in your chapter are context and meaning. There's a context also to this conversation, and I think it would be appropriate probably to start with asking you to describe the context to this conversation. If you can you contextualize it in terms of the 4-year history that we've been interacting with each other?
Well, I'm a musician, a composer and pianist by training, a music history teacher and music historian by professional necessity. And in learning how to teach complex musical issues to people who can't read music, I've had to come up with a way, a vocabulary, a methodology of telling stories that allow an educated listener, if not an educated musician, to glom onto the basic meaning in a piece of music. And it has to do with creating a context for a piece of music. Where was it composed? Why was it composed? Who was the composer? Why is this representative of a composer's work? And what should we understand about a composer's life and time through this music? And what story does the music tell? And you came to me because you knew of my teaching, of the recordings that I've made for the last 25 years now. And we talked about how I come to grips, how I understand the world around me. And when I told you about my ideas about storytelling and creating a context for the music understudy, you felt that that was, right down the middle of this plate about understanding and about learning and about comprehending the larger world with a sensibility that takes us out of ourselves and allows us to see the world in ways we might not otherwise do, taking off our glasses, as it were. And so that's the context, I think, for my chapter, is how I've gone about understanding what music is about and how I've gone about teaching that to other people. That is, creating a broader cultural understanding and using the music as a vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you clearly, the chapter talks about the role of the teacher, and so implicitly you present yourself as a teacher, but you are many other things, as you already mentioned. You're also a composer, you're a historian, you are a kind of activist even, I think, if I could understand
that. Thank you.
And you are a family man, and most people, hopefully most people, are a couple of things that are very multidimensional. Like, it would be interesting actually if you could contextualize yourself in the context of your own history.
Well, I will just comment on one thing you said and then I'll do so. But if you're foolish enough to try a career in music or a career in any of the arts or a career as a videographer, you have to be able and willing to do anything. There's no absolute path, as if you're a lawyer or as if you're a doctor, and not that there are absolute paths for them too, but there are absolutely generalized paths. You go to medical school and then you do a residency and then you find a job and then you find another job and then blah, blah. You don't just find jobs if you're a musician. There is no one step after another. You have to create a lot of the opportunities for yourself and then hope that you know when to stop if you have to stop. So thank you, but you have to do a lot of things if you're a musician. My context, well, I grew up playing piano. That's what you did in my house. My grandmother graduated from the Juilliard Institute in 1916, when it was still called the New York Institute of Musical Art. And she was a brilliant pianist. And if you grew up in her family, you played the piano. She tortured my father to death with the piano. She tortured me half to death with the piano. But luckily, both my father and I ended up with some pretty high-level pianistic skills. There was never any question that I was going to be a musician. I took to composing very early. But as we were just saying, having graduated with a PhD in music composition, I was faced with a terrible reality, and that is no one wants another composer. I mean, the public thinks all composers are dead and have German names. So you need to do other things to feed your compositional habit. And since I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area and had no intention of ever leaving, I began teaching adult education as a way of making money. And adults have lots of life experience, but they don't necessarily know a damn thing about music. And so I had to figure out how to teach Mahler symphonies, how to teach Beethoven symphonies, how to teach Bach cantatas to an essentially musically uneducated but life-educated audience. And that meant I had to tell stories. I had to create context for the music, and I had to create a way of communicating the substance of these pieces without relying on music notation, without relying on technical jargon, which would have been a waste of these people's time in any case. And I found that I was really successful at that. Conversely, learning to talk about music this way, learning to tell the larger cultural story, taught me a tremendous amount and teaches me more every day, because there's no limit to the information you need to have. If you're talking about Russian music, you have to have mastered Russian society. Right now I'm reading a book on the Romanovs from 1613 to 1917, and I'm learning more. I'm understanding Glinka and Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich that much more by informing myself of the larger cultural context of their time. So I've come to my way of teaching, to my way of thinking about music, by actually doing it in the classroom, by doing it with people. And it has then come back and informed my composing. I'm a much better composer now, because when I write music, and happily I'm writing right now, I'm telling my story much more easily. It's just not such a struggle as it used to be. Maybe that's one of the good things about aging.
Teaching is a way of learning also.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hey, listen, I'm a huge believer. You never learn anything until you have to teach it to someone else. Just sitting passively receiving information takes you 1/4 of the way there. Then you got to internalize it and then give it back, externalize it, and then you learn it. So none of us ever learn anything the first go around, and I believe that to be true.
When you submitted your chapter, I was initially confused, even though you told me what you wanted to write. When it came in, I saw the title, started reading, I thought, what do I do with it?
I'm glad you didn't burn it or turn it into paper airplanes. Thank you.
Interesting thing is, it led me to start thinking about is how what you write about music applies in all kinds of other areas that I'm particularly, well, I'm familiar with music, of course, but I'm also a physicist, and I think, well, what does this mean actually in terms of a discipline like physics or any other way of in which people seek understanding? And I eventually came to the conclusion, yes, this is a very essential component of what it means to start understanding things. So instead of this being seen by me as editor as a sort of lost chapter among the whole bunch of it, I now think it's the key chapter, and I intend to put it at the front end of the book. It's very important, I think, that people are aware of that. And but you may yourself actually, as you like I myself, I have different ways of being in the world. You too do have that. How does this idea of contextualizing and understanding things within context apply beyond the area of appreciating music?
I think it applies to virtually everything. I'll tell a story and then double back, because
okay, you need to tell stories. Of course.
I mentioned my grandmother. 5 foot tall, 4'11". You know, she had those baggy, fatty grandma underarm things, but she also had forearms like Schwarzenegger. And that's because she had studied back there, the early part of the 20th century, a pianistic method called the Leishativsky method. And what this method taught was that you never moved the arm or the shoulder. Everything came from the finger, and you had to pretend that there was an egg under your hand, and she would put a pencil on top. And if the pencil fell off or you flattened your hand, she'd swat you. Now, of course, we know that all this it's a prescription for carpal tunnel syndrome. This is a prescription for destruction of your arms.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're genetically blessed and you don't destroy your arms, you build up a musculature like you can't believe. She could pop a walnut between her forearm and her bicep. And this was as a little old lady. So she was scary that way. The point is, playing piano cannot be limited to the hands. Playing the piano is, in truth, a full body activity that involves the buttocks, where we get our power, our shoulders, our back, everything. Nothing we do is adjust this or adjust that. It seems to me virtually every human activity, and I mean this, is a full body activity, a full mind activity. Now, back to your question. If we don't understand the context of something, I mean, listen, I would love to understand strange science, the science of microparticles and such. And I read as much popular literature as I can. The best writers are those who can tell a story that at least allow me to, in some ways, glimpse the imagination of these extraordinary particle physicists, whose minds function at a level so far beyond the normal human being it makes me feel like a very small simian. Without the story, with just facts, it's like my grandmother playing piano with just her hands. One has to tell a larger story about what this might mean. One of the things I love about the way Einstein used to write, because he would talk about thought experiments, contextualizing something by bringing in every tool we might have. How else are we supposed to perceive the grand truths if we limit ourselves to tiny aspects or just facts? So that, to me, is my reaction to your question. How can we not seek context in everything? How can we not search for the larger truth? Because only the larger truth gives meaning to the detail. Mm-hmm. Detail by itself is unconnected to anything else. Now, some people are great with detail. I'll be honest with you, as a scholar, I'm a generalist. I suck the lifeblood out of those detail-oriented people who research to death one little topic. I take their material, and now I broadly smear it with other material and try to find a larger story. That, to me, is context. So we need those researchers. We need those detail-oriented people. They push the envelope of information. But to make it accessible, to make it useful, we have to weave it into a larger narrative. Mm-hmm. And especially, if I may momentarily be political here, what's going on in the United States right now, from our leadership in terms of science, in terms of the arts, is so antithetical to humanism, to what we've been over the last 400 years as a species, looking forward, trying to understand, trying to explain. We must constantly now seek the larger story. We must insist that all of this information, all of this understanding be applied in the largest possible context. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise we will allow these ideologues to lie even more about the environment, to lie even more about our bodies, to lie even more. We must keep the eye on the larger subject. So I feel very strongly, not just intellectually, but emotionally, that we must always seek the big picture. And that means including as much as we can in that picture.
The implications for what we do in the various education systems, right? Where the best teaching in any discipline that is being taught in school would be teaching it within a particular context of that discipline, but that there is also a context of context. And
that's the huge challenge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And that would be it's a huge challenge, but a beautiful challenge and a very necessary challenge to be met if one really wants people to build themselves in a way that we can live in the world that we have. I think it's very important, the particular time that we are living in now, the Anthropocene, where we see that humanity has a tremendous impact on its own habitat. And if we are to survive, we need to build an entirely different kind of understanding.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You know, even it seems to me, I mean, looking back at my high school education, I had some wonderful teachers, and I had some not so wonderful teachers. It's true for all of us. It's most difficult in something like math, which is such a process-oriented discipline. But if not context, enthusiasm. I had a math teacher named Mr. Rocco who loved what he did. The math, this was algebra 2, I remember. It thrilled him. And that was enough. That was enough. His thrill became our thrill. You know, we made fun of him because kids make fun of everybody. But here I am, 50 years later, recalling Mr. Rocco and his enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. But even math, especially in this day and age, in a computer age, in a digital age, even math now, it seems to me, can be made, as you learn the processes, brought into the larger context. How is this stuff applicable to the technological world in which we live today? Yeah, it makes teaching harder, but of course it makes it so much more satisfying if you can find a way of bringing the larger world into your classroom.
How is it applicable, and also how come that particular developments in mathematics take place at a particular
Mm-hmm.
time in a particular culture?
Mm-hmm.
So there are all issues that normally not are being dealt with
Right.
in school. That's
right. Listen, I went through all of high school math, and I mean, maybe Euclid's name came up in terms of geometry, but there was never a historical context given to algebra or geometry or what this meant. And I, again, speaking for myself, the way my mind works, if my geometry teacher, Mr. Bankus, had talked about, you know, a sextant and how learning this geometry allowed virtually the planet to be explored because now longitude and latitude could be measured and blah, 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 blah. I would have been fascinated. I would have been stuck to the desk. I wouldn't have wanted to leave because it would have changed the entire conversation. So that's me. That's me. That's not everybody. And I understand that. But I've always had to assume that what interests me interests everyone else.
right. Now, methods has, among other things, something to do with quantification. And you don't like the modernists very much among the musicologists and among the composers. And I recall one issue that you bring up on in your chapter has to do with the rejection of anything but what is quantifiable. Mm-hmm. Would that mean that understanding cannot take place if we are talking about quantifiable things, or in your view?
What's quantifiable? I mean, I would just refer to what you're referring to and share with our listeners and viewers. When I was in college between 1972 and 76 as an undergraduate, my teachers rather, were truly modernists. That is, the post-World War II generation that believed that music should be discussed only in terms of itself. So you couldn't use any exterior terminology, any historical terminology. You couldn't say sonata form or minuet and trio. You could hardly even say words like symphony. Every piece existed simply as itself. You couldn't discuss the life of the composer. You couldn't discuss the aesthetic or religious aspects of the time in which it was created. Nothing. The piece had to be dissected using a methodology that had nothing to do with the historical context of its composition. I mean, if you told Beethoven what his Third Symphony was all about, he would slap you, because you were examining these pieces as if they were laboratory samples, and you're just dissecting little pieces and never letting anything else in. But that was that whole post-war new criticism mentality, and I understand the context of that mentality. By the way, the catastrophe of the Second World War, the catastrophe of fascism and Nazism, of the atom bomb, 1933, or if you want to go back further, you know, to the late 20s, when you see the militarism in Japan taking over that nation, the period between 1930 and 1945 changed everything. It changed the human race, it changed our aspirations, and I just don't mean technology. We descended as a species to a level of barbarity that no one in the modern world believed could ever have been possible. The dark inner core was ripped open for us to see. And for a lot of post-war artists and musicians and thinkers and scientists and mathematicians, this meant purging the body of repertoire of politics that had anything to do with emotionalism, romanticism, fantasy, and applying pure intellect. This was a way of clarifying the future, purging us from this past, and making ourselves less animalistic and more intellectual. So I understand why these musicians wrote this music. This was part of that process, part of a historical necessity. And again, because I have that context, I understand why they did that. But I also have the context and the joy of being able to report that once they had passed, the generation of students that studied with them, like me, rejected their teaching and have re-embraced, if not a more romantic, then at least a more effective way of communicating with our audiences. We've opened the door back up again. But again, from a historical perspective, these modernists, these new critics as they were, it was a necessity. A distance had to be put between us and the art and politics and mentality that allowed the Second World War to take place. So again, you know, everything, without that context, I'd still be angry. You know, of having wasted all that time and money. But
you were born after World War II, right?
I was born in 54, so 9 years after born.
Because what you're saying reminds me of my own past. I was born before World War II, in 1938.
Wow.
And
so you and your family survived the occupation?
Yes. But we lived in Rotterdam, and we had this very bad
bombing.
So-called the bombing in first
the
place.
terror bombing is what it was.
And but that was a case of mass destruction.
Yeah, just to show
in
what they could
context
do. Yes.
of that time.
Right.
And then we had a hunger winter in 1944 and to 5, and I grew up as a child. As an observer, which you are as a child, you don't ask yourself many questions, but after it's over, you start thinking about it, you start reading about it, and you start discovering how bad humanity is. And in fact, my choice to turn to physics had something to do with that. I don't like humans. But this is something I can be passionate about.
So there you go. You're expressing exactly what I was witness to in my generation of post-war composers who were my teachers, and that was an utter rejection of the values of the previous generation.
And I was actually listening to electronic music by Hank Badings.
You're the poster child.
Very interesting.
Very interesting. So again, I understand why that generation of composers and artists and critics went the way they did. I also understand why we had to learn from that and then reject it, because it rules out too much.
I got over it.
Yeah, well, as we do. But we're informed by it at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, there's an observation in your chapter. You say, music is not a science, it's a language art. How relevant is it to split the world up in those two cultures? You say music, and you identify music as a language art. Is that in separation of a science, or can we somehow place it in a context that it comes together?
I think it's a priority. It's a matter of prioritizing what it is, not again,
You don't approach music in the way that the hard sciences do, the sciences that work with quantifiable entities.
I think that there's a lot, if you're analyzing a piece of music, if let's say I sit down and I hear a piece I really like and I want to steal from it, because that's why composers analyze, they want to steal. So I analyze the piece, and I might analyze it in what you would consider a fairly scientific way. But I'm doing that in order to create a bigger storyline so that I can use it for my own purposes. Music is not a science, although we can approach it scientifically. It is a language art, but sometimes we need to be analytic. So what I'm doing is prioritizing. Is it just a science, or is it something bigger? Of course it's something bigger. But we can approach it scientifically as long as we remember that by approaching it scientifically, it's to find whatever jewels power a piece of music, so that those jewels are now accessible not just to us, but whomever. You know, if you're a conductor, your essential job isn't to wave a stick. Your essential job is to point that stick at your eyes and get those musicians to look at your eyes, to see your passion and your understanding of the piece. That's what a conductor does, is interpret a piece of music. A great conductor, even a good conductor, has to figure out what the storyline in a piece of music is, both its technical storyline, how it's put together, what its landmarks are, what the big articulations are, and then what you want your audience to hear. First you have to teach the performers, then you have to teach your audience.
But is there anything that in the world that is just a language art or a science?
Well, you know what, no matter what I answer, I'm going to get this probably wrong in my own mind, but I would say there's nothing that's just any one thing. Yeah. Again, we're human beings. We're not automatons. We feel things. Our impressions are very powerful. I would be loath to say anything could be one thing or the other. I just couldn't bring myself to do that.
Yeah, and could be both together, of course.
Everything could be anything, really.
Well, I think towards the end of your chapter, you start talking about the concept of meaning. And it rose a question in me, what is the meaning of meaning? What do we actually mean when we say music has meaning?
I'm using that because you are a deep thinker. When I say meaning in this context, it's fairly simple. And that is, I'm saying that the music would seem to have a narrative, emotional content that goes beyond merely notes and harmonies and textures. That when I speak to you, my tone of voice, my choice of vocabulary, the rhythm of my words, how it goes up and down, carries a meaning that's greater than just the individual parts of speech. That's what I'm referring to. Now, as I do mention in the article, Igor Stravinsky very famously in 1936 in his autobiography, a very premature autobiography, incidentally, he lived for decades more, said that music is essentially incapable of expressing anything. Later in his life, he kind of took that back. He said, I'm not really going to take it back, but all right, I was just trying to get at some people who were really bugging him. You know, he was getting a lot of criticism for the music he was writing at the time, and he just wanted to say, okay, it means nothing, so leave me alone. But it is a good question. Does music by itself, does anything by itself have the power to evoke an emotional response? And that to me is meaning, an emotional response.
When a person says that particular piece of music has meaning for me, what does that mean?
It could mean two things right off the top of my head. First, just a visceral emotional response when we listen to music. And this is very subjective, because one person's visceral emotional response is another person's pablum. Nevertheless, it's virtually impossible, it seems to me, for any of us to hear music that we grew up listening to when we were teenagers not to have a visceral response to it, because it represents our coming to sexual age, it represents our friends, it represents our world when it was still a clean and pure place. And I always say there's two kinds of music. The music we listened to or played when we were teenagers and everything else. So that's just a visceral emotional response. But there's another level of meaning as well. And I can evoke Beethoven because he's like Mr. Narrative. He tells stories in his music. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a very famous piece, justly, rightly so, starts out quite brutally, grows, falls apart again, and then grows again. Beethoven does this in his music. He takes very simple ideas and manipulates them so they become longer and frankly more tuneful. Then he destroys them by stripping their notes away until nothing's left, and then rebuilds them again. So there's a larger meaning here. There's a metaphorical meaning. There's an allegorical meaning. Why did you do this, Louis? That's what his friends called him. He was Louis, or Ludwig, or Luigi. They rarely called him Ludwig. Why did you do this, Louis? Why did you write this piece? What does it mean? From a narrative point of view. Mm-hmm. So in my article, that's what I'm talking about, is musical narrative. That is, why does a composer make the choices he or she makes? And what is it supposed to mean based on those choices? And there is meaning. There is utter absolute meaning, not just interpretation. And it's okay for me to teach that because I've lived long enough and thought long enough about this, and I'm familiar enough with the literature to know that there's a general consensus on what this stuff means, and it's perfectly okay to say so. So I say two levels of meaning right off the top. Visceral response, and then a deeper narrative meaning that a composer puts in a piece of music. I'm a composer. Everything I write means something. I'm trying to tell a story. And 99.99% of all composers do the same thing. You know, it's easier in literature, right? All literature has some sort of meaning because we're used to the absolute meaning of words. Mm-hmm. All right, music is a more abstract thing. There is no absolute vocabulary, but there is a syntax. And if someone writes something low on a piano that's in minor and plods forward in 2/4, we're all going to have the same response. It's a funeral march. That's what it sounds like. Part of that is a conditioned response, but part of it is its slowness and the darkness of minor mode. So there are all sorts of ways of evoking narrative meaning in music. By the way you treat materials, the way you bring materials back, the way you vary them, the way you develop them, that create narrative structure. So that's the deeper meaning. That's what I can teach.
You argue very interestingly that music is, the emergence of musical appreciation is a consequence of evolution. And I think that's quite interesting an observation in the first place. But when I read it, I also thought, well, does it really make us unique? Yes, of course, we make music the way that we do, we appreciate it. But our cat, how musical is that animal? Cat that we have at home, when I start playing the piano, and he knows when that starts happening in the daily routine at between 10 and 10:30 in the evening. He comes to my office, wants me to sit at the piano, and starts listening. And recognizes particular pieces of music. He knows when it comes to an end. So there is a rudiment, perhaps, of that same evolutionary track available in other species.
Look at whales who sing to each other by way of, again, I'm not saying that high art music, a la, European practice in the last 400 years is evolutionary. But I am saying the impulse to make music is, and it's pan-species, it's not just us. I mean, think about primitive societies and the role music, or at least drumming, might play in those societies. It plays a religious role. It elevates the mind and makes it accessible to divine influence. Ritual. We all move together when we're listening to the same music. We dance together. We mate together. We fight together. Band music is meant to make people march, particularly men, into battle and to inspire them. These are all profoundly deep impulses generated by rhythm and pitch. And if you think about art music as simply a cultivation of these, an enlargement, a heightening of these impulses to dance, to drum, to sing. There are other animal species that use all the same things in organizing their activities, in organizing how they move socially. They might not have religions that we know of, but this idea of using pitch and rhythm to organize group behaviors goes beyond Homo sapiens. Okay, we've cultivated it, we've grown it, but it's an essential impulse. It's a survival skill. As I said in the article, evolution generally does not make mistakes. It doesn't waste energy over long periods of time on something that's going to die out. And this rhythmic musical impulse is intrinsic to what we are, and it allows tribes to flourish, and it allows tribes to stay intact in a way that they might not without it. And I think that's really fascinating, and I've thought about it a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, to conclude, at the end of your chapter, you come back to the proponents of the new criticism, modernism, and say, by denying the interconnectedness of art with life, they are subscribing to a worldview of utmost loneliness.
Indeed.
Could you elaborate on it?
Thank you for bringing that up based on the statement I just made about the tribe. If we isolate every aspect of something from the larger world, there is no larger world. There's only a singularity. And I find such a singularity very lonely, very isolating. We're part of a larger community where everything interconnects at some very powerful level. And that's what I celebrate. That's what turns me on. That's what makes my life worth living at those moments of, oh my goodness, of despair, is that I can look at something now and feel a larger attachment. But if we spend our whole lives chopping and splitting and taking only the smallest increment of anything, that to me is antithetical to the human experience, and very lonely.
Bob, thank you so much.
My pleasure.